All right, welcome back, y'all. It is good to see your smiling faces. We're going to talk today about communication ethics, and I told you during the first week of class that I had a secret for you, and that secret is that I have a long history of suffering with communication apprehension, something that I've been working on, something that I've tried to overcome. I probably would not be able to be in this job if I were not able to overcome something like that. Another secret I have for you is that I enjoy teaching communication ethics, but I also kind of hate teaching communication ethics. So this is one of the hardest lessons for me to teach, not because I don't think it's important. I actually think it's probably the most important lesson we'll have this semester. Not because I don't like the content or I find the content to be too challenging, but really because I don't feel like I can do justice to communication ethics in a 50-minute session. One 50-minute session in a 16-week class is not going to teach you everything that you need to know about communication ethics. So I always feel like I'm a bit taking on a Herculean task that I'm not quite adequately able to do in this lesson. But nevertheless, I want to introduce you to some concepts of communication ethics, and I want you to be familiar with how communication ethics might play out not just in your speeches, but also in your everyday lives. So we're going to start off today with a scenario. I'm going to give you an ethical dilemma, and I want you to think about what you would do in this scenario. So we're going to have a little bit of a debate. I want you to think about what your position might be at the end of this debate. The scenario is what I have up on the board here. You've got two friends, Jordan and Leah, and you as a third party have been watching the two of them flirt together for the last month, or at least what looks like flirting. Jordan decides he's going to ask Leah out, and when he does, he's surprised, but she turns him down. She says to him, "I really like you, but I'm just not in the place to date anyone right now. I'm going through some personal stuff. I hope you understand." Y'all are with me so far? This is probably a pretty familiar scenario to you all. Then you go and you decide to talk to another friend of yours, your friend Michael, and Michael tells you a rumor that he heard from multiple sources that Leah recently found out she has an STD. Michael is good friends with Leah and has never lied to you, but he's also never asked Leah directly about the rumor because he's afraid that it's going to hurt their friendship. So you hear this information from Michael, and right after you hear this information from Michael, Jordan decides he's going to call you on the phone. He's going to ask you for advice. He's confused and hurt, but he still wants to date her. He has not heard the rumor that she has an STD. So my question for you, the ethical dilemma that I'm going to pose to you, is you are on the phone with Jordan. You've got to make up your mind. You don't have a whole lot of time to do that. Do you tell Jordan this rumor about Leah, or do you decide to keep it to yourself? Figure out if you strongly agree that you would tell him. You agree that you would tell him, but you've got some reservations. You disagree, but you're not sure if that's the right decision, or you strongly disagree, you absolutely would not tell him. Go ahead, and I'll put the scenario back up on the board for you. Make sense of whatever you can out of it. Be aware that there's going to be some things that I can't answer for you. This is the scenario as is, but I want you to talk to a friend of yours and figure out, do you agree you're going to tell him? Do you disagree you're not going to tell him, and why? So go ahead and talk to a neighbor. I'll flash the lights when I feel like we're ready to come back as a whole group. Do you tell him? Do you not tell him? All right, it's quiet enough in here that I don't have to flash the lights, which is nice. Go ahead, raise your hand if you strongly agree you would tell Jordan that rumor. Okay, fair amount of you, mostly male. Raise your hand if you agree that you would tell Jordan the rumor, but you've got some reservations about it. Raise your hands if you disagree, but you have some reservations about that. Raise your hand if you strongly disagree, you absolutely would not tell Jordan the rumor. Handful of you, mostly female. Interesting. Now, what I want you to do is actually to try and convince the other people in the classroom why you chose the answer that you chose. Try to get them into your camp. So if you're in the strongly agree camp and somebody else is in the strongly disagree camp, try to convince them that your camp is actually the right one. Who wants to go? Raise your hands. What do you tell him, what do you not tell him, and why? Try and convince the rest of the class. We had some people with some pretty strong opinions on this one, so I expect somebody to raise their hand. Go ahead. Okay, one of my favorite expressions, not my circus, not my monkeys. I think what you're saying there is it's not really my responsibility to interfere in Jordan and Leah's relationship. What's happening with them is between them, not my issue. Is that right? Okay, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so there's some laughter in here. I know this is a little bit of a sensitive subject, especially at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. But nevertheless, there's some health concern here as well. So Jordan and Leah are not dating right this second, but maybe later on they will end up dating or hooking up. It's possible that he could get an STD from Leah if she does have one, and if he does and he knows that you knew in advance, that could be a problem. Okay? Other thoughts? Yeah? Okay, so as of right now, it's just a rumor. This rumor you heard from what you think is a trustworthy source. He thinks that he heard it from other trustworthy sources, but nevertheless, the rumor hasn't been verified. Michael hasn't asked Leah directly about this situation. He hasn't confirmed it with anybody, and so if we share unsubstantiated rumors, we could end up hurting people, especially Leah, but others as well. Go ahead.
When they start dating, the person, if you have an STD, they should mention it to their partner. So it's between them, and again, it's just a rumor.
Okay. So if somebody does happen to have an STD and they're about to hook up with someone, it is their responsibility. In most places, it's actually law that they're supposed to disclose that information to you. So it's her responsibility if she does have an STD to share that with Jordan if they are going to get together. Nevertheless, some people don't share that information. So it goes. Okay. Other thoughts? Anybody else want to try and persuade us? It sounds like we're mostly in the not going to tell Jordan camp. Are there any other reasons? Yeah, go ahead. Okay, so one way to handle the situation is just to tell Jordan it's on him to figure out what he's going to do. Fair enough. Other thoughts? Yep. How is this related to COM 110? It's a good question we will come back to. But I want to see if there are any other closing thoughts before we do that. Yeah.
I would say if I was Jordan, I would want to know even if it was true. I could figure it out for myself.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's just a rumor, but rumors don't come things, so making sure you're not upset.
So one way to handle it is to say, I've heard this thing about Leah, I haven't confirmed it, but nevertheless, it's possible that you might want to stay away from her. Nevertheless, it's possible that this might be just a rumor and it might not be substantiated. It might help Jordan's feelings not to feel like she's rejecting him because of something he did, but maybe because of something that's beyond his control, possibly beyond her control as well. So the question was, why does this relate to COM 110? And the reason that this relates to COM 110 is something called cognitive dissonance. It's something called ethical dilemmas. You all have probably experienced this at some point in your life, where you have been confronted with a situation and you can decide, I go with course A or I go with course B. Ethical dilemmas often happen because we like two things that are incompatible with one another at the moment. So what we have in this particular situation is a triangle that is not balanced. If all three parts in the triangle are all getting along, then we don't really have an ethical dilemma. We don't have cognitive dissonance. What cognitive dissonance is that uncomfortable feeling in our minds of, I don't know what I should do, I don't know if I've made the right decisions. A lot of you had pretty strong opinions on this one. A lot of you felt like maybe you didn't have such strong opinions on this one. As we were talking, I think some of you might have gravitated a little bit more toward the center, even if you did have strong opinions. But cognitive dissonance is that feeling that we get when we're up at 2 o'clock in the morning, wondering if some decision that we made today, some decision that we made 5 years ago, 10 years ago, was the right decision. And what happens with cognitive dissonance is you've got a triangle that's off balance, and you're trying to resolve that imbalance. A lot of people are very uncomfortable with cognitive dissonance. As human beings, we like our ethics, we like our ideas to be simple, we like them to be straightforward. We like to know whether we're making a good decision. We're going to talk a little bit more about why that's often not the case. But nevertheless, when we are dealing with ethics, what we're often dealing with is things that are in conflict with one another. So another way to put this is not just when you have Jordan and Leah who have somehow not had the relationship that you thought that they would have. You're having to decide if you want to make a relationship between Jordan and Leah happen, or if you want to choose one over the other by disclosing information or not disclosing information. You've got a little bit of a dilemma where you could share that information with Jordan and maybe hurt Leah. You could share that information with Leah and maybe Leah gets mad at Michael or mad at other people who shared that information with Michael. You could not share any information at all. The point here is that when we communicate, we have a lot of decisions. And a lot of our decisions that we make interpersonally are also similar to decisions that we have to make when we give speeches. Especially later on in the semester, we're going to get into persuasive speaking, and a lot of you are going to give speeches where you advocate for something where some people benefit and some people suffer as a result of a policy that you advocate. It could be that that policy is about something like immigration. It could be that that policy is about something like abortion. It could be something that's a little bit less of a common topic. But nevertheless, when we make speeches, and especially when we make persuasive speeches, we have ethical dilemmas. And oftentimes it feels like a triangle that's unresolved. It feels like we have decisions that we have to make that are not easy decisions to make, and those decisions have consequences. When we're talking about ethical systems, there's a lot of different ways that we could talk about them. We could talk about virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is coming out of Aristotle. Oftentimes virtue ethics is what makes me a good person. Well, it depends on who you talk to. We could have a system like utilitarianism. A lot of you are probably familiar with this as the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Our ethical systems have different principles that guide them, and sometimes they answer questions for us, and sometimes we don't like the answers that our ethical system points us toward. There are a lot of different ethical systems. One of the reasons why I don't like teaching communication ethics and why I feel like I can't do justice to it in a semester or in 50 minutes is I've actually seen universities offer communication ethics as a graduate level seminar, so a 700 level class, 16 weeks where they talk nothing about ethical dilemmas like the ones you just saw. And still at the end of the semester, I guarantee you if you talk to the professor, if you talk to the students in that graduate seminar, they're going to tell you that communication ethics is messy. And the reason for that is because we have things that we value. In this case, it's relationships with these two people or relationships with someone who's not mentioned in the triangle, Michael. Nevertheless, when we make decisions, we're often deciding among various values. So I've listed a lot of the most common values up on the screen here. What I'd like you to do again is to take a look at this screen, figure out if you had to decide at this point in your life right now, what would be your top 3 values on this list? Take a second, look it over. When you feel like you're pretty confident in what your top 3 values are, I want you to again discuss them with somebody else in the class. So again, figure out your top 3. And once you have your top 3, share them with someone next to you. See if they have the same values as you have. All right, it seems like enough of you have been able to share with somebody else. Raise your hand if you and the other person you shared with had the exact 3 same top values. Raise your hand if you had 1 or 2 in common. A handful of you, okay. Raise your hand if you and the other person you shared with had none of these same values in common. Quite a few of you as well. The reason I share this with you is because when we're dealing with cognitive dissonance, we're not always dealing with relationships between people. Oftentimes, we're dealing with relationships between abstract ideas and abstract values. Values are things that we care about. Values are things that we take seriously and things that we strive toward. So one cognitive dissonance triangle that you might encounter is not you, Jordan, and Leah, but maybe you, love, and sex. There's somebody who you're not attracted to, but maybe has easy access to sex. And you decide maybe you're going to sleep with that person, and maybe you will think that's a good idea later, or maybe not so much. It could be that your values that are in conflict are your honesty and your knowledge. And maybe you have the opportunity to cheat on a test, and you have to decide, are you the kind of person who cheats on a test or not? Now, a lot of people don't like the feeling of cognitive dissonance. They don't like knowing that they have to choose among these different values. I always love asking a room full of 300 students to pick their top 3 values on this list because it's really fun to watch a lot of you struggle and say, I don't know. I mean, I feel like I could probably have 10 or 15 of these that I value. Maybe I want to value all of these things or most of these things. How do you ask me to choose my top 3? One of the reasons why ethics gets complicated just on an abstract level, on our own individual level, before we move to the interpersonal level or the public level where we're communicating information to a large audience, is that our values are not necessarily the same values. If I were to ask you to pick your top 3 values right now, even though we just did it 10 seconds ago, some of you might choose different values. Some of you might wake up tomorrow or 10 years from now and have a different set of your top 3 values. We like to think of human beings as stable. We're not always all that stable. And oftentimes we have to make difficult choices, and those choices involve cognitive dissonance. Human beings, by and large, don't like that feeling. They like to try and resolve it as quickly as possible. We like our ethics to be simple. We like our ethics to be straightforward. Oftentimes, they're not always that way. Now, how does this all connect back then to COM 110? Why does this have to do with speech? The reason is because when we make our choices, we're often deciding what information we want to communicate. It's not just our values that come into the picture, but also what we say about those values, what we don't say, who we say them to, what kind of context our values operate in, what kinds of cognitive dissonance we're experiencing in that context. We talked a little bit about the communication model. And I like the communication model as a way of figuring out what goes wrong when communication doesn't move from a source to a receiver, and the receiver disagrees with the source's message or misunderstands that source's message. A lot of people like to use the communication model to try and figure out a sense of ethics. And I'll tell you that that doesn't really work all that well. So I told you all, a lot of you are going to be giving speeches, especially when you give persuasive speeches later on in the semester, where the information that you decide to give in your speech topic, your position on that topic, your evidence, your reasoning for how you support all of that, you're going to try and think about that from a communication perspective. So you're going to say, I have this position. I know other people in my audience disagree with that position. How do I get them over to my side, even if they're on the losing end of the proposal that I'm about to make? Even if they are a Democrat and I'm a Republican, or vice versa? How do I get people on my side? A lot of people like to jump to the communication model as a way of trying to tell them what their ethics are or what their ethics should be. The communication model is not really designed to be an ethical model. It's designed to be more of an instrumental or practical model. That is, how do I craft my message in such a way that it gets to my receiver and the receiver takes away the message that I want them to get away from it? Ethics don't really work like that. And so part of why I'm teaching you ethics on top of how to get what you want is because I think a lot of communication classes and a lot of public speaking classes don't do that. Or if they do that, they don't do it all that well because they're not really sensitive to the fact that we have lots of ethical systems and that ethics are not just this instrumental, how do I as the source get the receiver on my side kind of model. Part of why this doesn't work is because there's a lot of information embedded within communicative contexts that are not necessarily clear. We want to have all the answers. We want to know what the right course of action is. When we're talking about this scenario here, a lot of you said there's one defining thing in this that says, I'm not going to tell Jordan because it's not fair to Leah. I am going to tell Jordan because I'm concerned about his health and I'm concerned about his well-being. There's a lot of pieces in this debate that we don't have the answers to. What are some of those things that might help you make a better decision if you were able to answer some of those unresolved things in this model or in this scenario? Yeah. Okay, so we might want to know, how are Jordan and Leah going to react to news? We want to know a little bit about their personalities. Is Jordan the kind of person who will get over Leah pretty quickly, or is he the kind of person who will dwell on her? Is Leah the kind of person who will get mad if information is shared without her consent, or is she the kind of person who is able to speak for herself and defend herself? What else might we want to know? I'm sorry? Yeah, one of the main things we would want to know is if that rumor were actually true. We've only heard it as a rumor. As a couple of you said, that rumor was not substantiated. We don't know whether Leah actually has an STD, but if we knew that information, it might help us. What else might we want to know about this scenario that we don't have the answers to? Yeah. Yeah, we don't know why Leah doesn't want to go out with Jordan. She says, I really like you, I'm just not in a place to date anyone right now. Her message in that moment is not all that clear. She's probably being what some communication scholars call strategically ambiguous. That is, she doesn't want to tell him the exact reason why she doesn't want to date him. It could be that she has an STD. It could equally be that she wants to focus on school, that she's got family stuff going on, that she's got some mental health concerns going on, that she just plain out doesn't like him. There are lots of things that we wish we could know before we jump into the communication model and try to decide, do I, the source, tell Jordan, the receiver, this message about Leah, and if so, what consequences are going to result from that? The communication model is not very good for telling us what we should do, because we could equally decide, yes, I do want to tell Jordan, no, I don't want to tell Jordan. So in the absence of that being the way to figure out what we do, what our course of action should be, we often have to grapple with what the consequences are of our actions. We also have to grapple with questions of intent. We have to grapple with questions of how the different parts of the model might play out if we decide one course of action over the other. I'll give you another example here. I told my lab students who aren't here, they're in my other lecture section, about my master's thesis. I wrote my master's thesis on a trial that took place after the Rwandan genocide. And in that trial, there was a scenario where there were media executives who were working for a local newspaper or magazine and working for a radio station, the dominant radio station in Rwanda, where there wasn't television, there wasn't really other competition from other radio stations. There were a bunch of media executives who were spreading what we would call probably hate speech, or maybe even genocidal speech. They were saying things about another ethnic group. So these media executives happened to be Hutus. They were spreading information about the Tutsi ethnic group in Rwanda. And what ended up happening is, prior to the genocide, there had been lots of skirmishes in Rwanda. There was something akin to a civil war. A lot of it goes back to the colonial history of Belgians conquering Rwanda and coming in and saying, these people are Hutu, these people are Tutsis, and there was a long history of the Belgians favoring Tutsis. So there had been some skirmishes over time since the Belgians left, since Rwanda gained independence. What happened is there were media executives, there was kind of like a civil war going on the year or so prior to the genocide. There were media executives spreading a whole bunch of hate speech, saying a whole bunch of really nasty things about Tutsis, saying that they were evil, saying that they were coming to take your women, saying that they were planning to overthrow the government. And this was going on for months prior to what ended up being the Rwandan genocide. What ended up happening is the president of Rwanda happened to be Hutu as well. His plane and the plane from the president of a neighboring country went down. It was shot down. It was unclear who shot down that plane. But nevertheless, within a few hours, the Hutu media executives were going over this radio station, the RTLM, and saying things like, go cut the tall trees, which essentially meant it's time, rise up and kill your Tutsi neighbors. It got even more intense than that. There were times when they were over the radio station saying, there's a group of Tutsis in this location, go to this location and kill them. over the radio. They were giving away information. Over the next 100 days, about 800,000 people were killed, a lot of them Tutsis, some of them Hutu defenders of Tutsis. And there was a trial that took place over whether these media executives should be held responsible for what we call incitement. Incitement is a concept, it's a legal concept that says my words lead to your actions. And so more specifically at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, we had a concept of incitement to genocide. That is, should these 3 media executives be held responsible for the actions that the genocidaires actually took? So the media executives were not the ones swinging the machetes, they were not the ones killing people. But what ended up happening is they were spreading a whole bunch of hate speech. They were telling people live on the air where to go to kill people. There's an argument over not necessarily whether their speech caused the genocide, but maybe whether it catalyzed the genocide. That is, did their speech maybe speed up the actions, make it more efficient, set the stage, set the context for the genocide, and maybe make it happen faster, or maybe they could have intervened in different ways. Before I tell you what happened as a result of that trial, I'm curious whether you agree that those media executives, as the source, helped cause the genocide in some capacity, or maybe helped catalyze it. Should they be held responsible for the genocide if they never actually killed anyone? Anybody want to volunteer? What do you think? Pretend that you are on the ICTR, you're deciding whether these guys should be held responsible for the genocide. Go ahead and talk to a neighbor about it. What do you think? Should they be held responsible for causing the actions of the people on the ground wielding the machetes? All right, let's come back together. You all clearly have some smart things to say. You're discussing them with one another. Let's see if anyone's brave enough to share with the class. What do you think? Would you find them guilty of this concept of incitement to genocide? Yeah.
No, I think it's just, we're trying to galvanize this freedom of speech or not. The problem is, I think, is that not so much, are they giving our information call to action?
Okay, so we have this question of freedom of speech, and we like to think that in the United States we have freedom of speech. There's different levels of freedom of speech around the world, across time. So we have this question over whether, even if they are responsible, do they still have the freedom to share that information, whether it's the hate speech that they were saying or the specific instructions to the people doing the killing. Other thoughts? Yeah. Okay, say more about that.
It is illegal to say that, to yell fire in a crowded theater and stuff like that in the United States. They had a Supreme Court hearing, but I don't know if they have something like that going on there.
Yes, even in the United States, there are certain limitations on freedom of speech. There are certain things that you're not allowed to say. But again, go back to the question of, independently of freedom of speech, we'll come back to that question as well. Do you think these 3 men should be held accountable for their actions if they didn't actually kill anyone? And if so, what do you think an appropriate punishment would be? Yeah.
We have a historical precedent.
Okay.
Like Charles Manson or like the Holocaust, like a lot of those people involved. Charles Manson never directly killed anybody, but he got held accountable for all the murders and like in the Holocaust, most of the high level facilitators never actually directly did anything except for the orders.
Yeah, so we actually have exactly one precedent to what you're talking about. You said that there's historical precedent, you pointed to Manson. The other historical precedent for incitement to genocide specifically, there's one other example in human history where that concept has appeared in an international court, and it was at the Nuremberg trials, like you said, after the Holocaust. The question of whether a media executive or propagandist can be held liable for something as large as genocide. I'll tell you what did actually happen in this scenario is that the 3 men were all tried, all 3 of them were convicted. They essentially got what amounted to life in prison. One of them died in prison already. The other 2 are still serving their sentences and probably will for the remainder of their lives. The point here is that the communication model isn't always the best way of deciding our ethics, but nevertheless, our actions have consequences, and we have to be mindful of the consequences of our speech. Even if we have the freedom of speech, even if we can say just about whatever we want, doesn't mean that we should, and doesn't mean that we're not responsible for what we end up saying. Doesn't mean that we might not end up hurting someone, or might end up hurting ourselves, or getting ourselves into trouble as a result of making speech of various kinds. Now, there's a historical precedent to this idea of communication ethics. There's an ideal standard of what constitutes a good public speaker. This is coming from Cato the Elder in Rome, and he says that a good speaker is what he called a vir bonus dicendi peritus. I don't speak Latin, that's the best I can do of that. But essentially what it translates to is a good person, or at the time it meant a good man speaking well. So we could take this idea from Cato the Elder. This was passed down through other people like Cicero and Quintilian. This idea that the ideal ethical speaker, the ideal good public speaker, is somebody who is not just a good person, but is also able to speak well. And we could take that and we could try to maybe chart it out on a graph, or try to chart it out in our minds in a table. What does it look like to have a good person who is able to speak but is only able to speak poorly? What does it mean to have a bad person speaking poorly? What does it mean to have a bad person speaking well? Ideally, we want to all think that we are a good person speaking well, or we want to think that the best speaker is somebody who has good ethics, good values, and not only has those values, but is able to communicate them in ways that we can understand. What I would like you to try to do as you're taking notes is try and think of somebody who fits into this category, each one of these categories. Who's a good person who's speaking poorly? What kind of influence do they have? Maybe we have a bad person speaking well. What kind of influence do they have? If we were to chart this out, we could probably think of lots of historical examples. A lot of you probably thought of world leaders. You probably thought of presidents, past or present. You probably thought of somebody who is influential in your life. Maybe you had a mentor or a coach or somebody who's able to speak very well. Cato the Elder's dictum here is one way of thinking about our ethics. And the idea is that we're trying to figure out what constitutes a good person. If we go back to our chart of values, though, all of you had, for the most part, different values that you thought were your top 3 values. So we don't always agree on what constitutes a good person. We also don't always agree on what constitutes speaking well. The ideal that I'd like you to strive for is to figure out for yourself, what does that mean? To figure out for members of the communities that you want to belong to, what does that mean to be a good person? And maybe there are other people who think that what your definition of a good person is not their definition. How would you handle people who disagree with you over that definition? It's a good idea in theory, this idea of the good person speaking well. In practice, it's a little bit hard to figure out what that means and how to get there. Beyond this, there's a couple other challenges with ethics and with speech. The first has to do with what we want language to be. If we think about speaking, a lot of us as human beings have natural desires of what we want speech to look like. If we were to live in a society where we could all get along and we could all make things work despite our differences, what we would call pluralism, a lot of us have some expectations about what our language and how we would talk to one another would consist of. The first thing is that we would want language to be clear. We want our language to be understandable. We want to make sure that we're referring to the same things. We want it to be specific. We want it to make sense. A second thing that we want our language to be is stable, that when I use the word justice and you hear the word justice, we're on the same page, we both agree on what that means. We also might think of stability in terms of denotation and connotation. If you look up a word in the dictionary, you're going to get one definition of it. That's what we would want at least, but you all have probably spent time looking at the dictionary where there's 7 or 8 different definitions for the same word. A lot of the times we want things to be pretty simple and we want them to be pretty stable across time, stable across context. We also want our language to be referential. If I'm talking about that table right there, I would want all 300 of you to know which table I'm talking about and that I'm pointing at the table. I don't want it to be that table when I actually mean the light fixture or the floor. We want our language to refer to things that we can all observe and all understand, and that the signifiers connected to the thing that's being signified. A fourth thing that we want out of our language is we want our language to be unambiguous. So if we have some things like a table, that's pretty concrete, that's something that we can all observe, that's something we can all feel, that's going to look very different from a concept like freedom. Look very different from something like ethics, something like justice. We want our language to be unambiguous. We want to all have the same meaning. We don't want that meaning to slip. Last but not least, we want our language to be agreed upon. So I pulled up the communication model to think about how, when that model works properly, both the source and the receiver have that same message. This is how most people want language to operate if we are to try and use language to make decisions, especially if we're using language to make decisions under conditions of uncertainty or disagreement. When we don't all have the same page, we want our language to be all of these things so that we can help get on the same page. So we want our language to look like that. We also have concerns of how we would want our ethics to be. A lot of people have certain expectations about what they would want their ethics to look like in a world where we could make decisions together. And the first thing there is we want our ethics to be rational. We want them to make sense. We want to be able to argue as to why this ethical system is the right one in this moment to make this decision. Closely related to that, we want our ethics to be grounded. That is, we want to have some principles. We want to have a system for deciding when we decide this way and when we decide that way, and how do we know. We want them to be grounded. So I mentioned a couple different types of ethical systems: utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number of people; consequentialism, only thing that matters is the effects of my speech, not the intent. The ends kind of justify the means. A lot of times our ethical systems that philosophers have spent millennia debating are in conflict with one another. They don't always match up, and nevertheless we want them to be grounded. We want them to have a logic to them. We want to be able to point to that logic and say, here's why I decided A and not B. Additionally, we want our ethics to be fairly simple. A lot of people like to know that they can make decisions and they don't have to think too hard about those decisions. Very rarely are ethics actually a simple matter. You've seen this through the cognitive dissonance triangles that I've pointed out to you. One of my favorite quotations from the Simpsons movie is a Arnold Schwarzenegger-like character who's elected as president, and he's got 5 decisions in front of him, and he points to, I think it's number 3, and they ask him, why did you choose number 3? And he says, I was elected to lead, not to read. So he just made up his mind, and it was simple. He just had 5 choices in front of him. He pointed to the one that he thought was the right one. A lot of times we want our ethics to be simple like that, where we don't have to think too hard, we don't have to experience too much cognitive dissonance, we resolve our choices and we feel pretty good about those. We also want our ethics to be fair. A lot of times ethical choices are problematic because there are people who stand to benefit. There are also people who stand to lose something from the ethical choices that we make. I don't like thinking of politics as a zero-sum game where there are always winners and losers. But nevertheless, a lot of times we have choices that we have to make, and sometimes those choices involve some people not getting their way. We want to make sure that we're trying to be as fair as possible to as many people as we can, if not everybody. And last but not least, we want to make sure that our ethics are decisive. Once we make up our mind, we don't have all this remaining cognitive dissonance where 5 or 10 or 20 years later we wake up and said, man, I made the wrong decision. Or we don't always want to be wondering and playing the what-if game. We want a lot of these things for our language. We want a lot of these things for our ethics. The problem with that is we very rarely get either one of those things. You probably, as I was talking, were thinking of some exceptions to some of these subcategories of what we want language or ethics to be. We often want our language to be perfect. We also want our ethics to be perfect. There is a 20th century rhetorician we'll come back to a few times in this class. His name is Kenneth Burke. He's one of the biggest public speaking and rhetoric instructors from the 20th century, one of the leading communication theorists. He, in his definition of man or definition of humanity, says that human beings are what he calls rotten with perfection. That is, we're always striving toward these really high ideals, even though as human beings we can't always get there. And so what happens is we are kind of obsessive. We're all kind of collectively perfectionists. We're constantly striving to be as ethical as possible, not just in our everyday interpersonal interactions, deciding whether to tell Jordan the rumor about Leah, but also in our speech when we give public speeches. How do we use our language in ways that get across our message, get across our intent, get across our ethical system? How do we also get other people on board with us in ways that are fair, decisive, clear, all of these things? We can't often have that, and that's part of why I don't feel like I can do justice to communication ethics in just 50 minutes. But if any of you want to follow up and talk more about communication ethics, it happens to be one of my favorite subjects. The point here is, again, that we often want our language and our ethics to be perfect. Unfortunately, neither one on its own is usually meeting all of those criteria of what would constitute perfection in either language or ethics. So if we're trying to figure out a speech ethics that pairs the two together, we're probably going to fall short. We're probably going to have some struggles. We're probably not going to have all of the answers right away. There's another way of thinking about ethics independent of that, or once we've come to that realization, and that is comparing ethics to other related systems. I don't expect you all to have this chart totally memorized, but it's important for us to be thinking about how ethics operate when they're compared to other things that we sometimes mistake for ethics. When we're talking about ethics, what we usually have are decisions of fair or unfair, or right or wrong. We have what Aristotle would have said, praise and blame. That is, we're trying to figure out what the best outcome is, or the worst outcome is. We're trying to figure out who's responsible. There's three other systems that often operate in place of our ethics, or maybe as a guide to our ethics. One of them, for a lot of people, is religion. A lot of people will look to religious texts to tell them whether something is ethical or not. And oftentimes, instead of being grounded in conscience or reason or individuality, religious ethics are grounded in sacred texts, or they're grounded in interactions with authority figures. They're grounded in how we interpret what our religion says to us we should and shouldn't do. Another way of looking at this is law. A lot of times we use law to try and get at our ethics. A lot of people will say you can't legislate people's morality. I've heard that a lot since I've moved to North Dakota. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court will often make decisions to help us as a nation with collective decisions that we've been struggling with. Think about Brown versus Board of Education. Think about some of the landmark Supreme Court cases. In that case, we have a judicial body, or sometimes we have Congress making laws for us. Somebody outside of us, whether it's legislative, executive, or judicial, is trying to tell us what is legal or not legal. And oftentimes people will conflate law and ethics, and they'll say they're the same thing, even though they're wholly separate. There is some overlap. We could probably make a Venn diagram of that. Last but not least, we have rules of etiquette. A lot of you will experience this. It might not feel ethical to you, or it might not feel like an ethical issue to you, but there's lots of etiquette over how we eat our food. What are some things that we're supposed to do? Are we supposed to use this fork for this? Are we supposed to use that fork for that? There's etiquette around how we're supposed to control our bodies. If we sneeze, if we cough, if we flatulate. Any of those things we have rules for about what we're supposed to do. We have rules for when we're in an elevator. You probably don't stand right next to the person in the elevator. You probably don't stare at that person. We have some rules that we like to think of as sort of these unwritten, unspoken ethical rules, even if we're not inclined to think of them that way. I want you to start thinking about how you might separate your communication ethics from these systems, or possibly some other ones in your life. One of the systems that's not up here is culture. We have a lot of cultural things that are appropriate in one culture and not appropriate in another culture. What I'm trying to get at here is that all of you will develop your own sense of ethics. That sense of ethics is probably not going to be bound with any one of these systems, but nevertheless, all of these systems probably influence your ethics. And what I want you to be able to do is to try and figure out what's ethical to you, what's ethical to the people in your community, what's ethical to the people who might be hurt by your decisions, because that's what's going to shape not only the values that you hold, but how you share those values with others, how you try to persuade people. We're going to be spending a couple weeks in the near future talking about how persuasion operates, and it's important for me, even if I can't do justice to communication ethics in 50 minutes, that you have some sense of it before you head into persuasion, because a lot of what we're going to learn once we get to that unit is more practical, more instrumental. How do you persuade people? How do you make an argument? How do you defend that argument? I want you to keep this conversation about ethics in mind because a lot of us are pretty uncomfortable when we make bad ethical decisions or when other people make those decisions for us. Now, another way of thinking about ethics is to think about what a lot of you have brought up over the course of today, and that's the idea of freedom of speech. We have a pretty strong free speech tradition in the United States. There's a reason why free speech is protected by a constitutional amendment, and as you are taking the speech class, I want you to think about some of the landmark, either Supreme Court cases or maybe lower court cases that you happen to know about free speech. To what degree do we protect speech? To what degree do we allow others to speak when we disagree with them? A lot of you probably feel like if someone is violating your free speech rights that you're being censored, that you're not being allowed to express yourselves, and you think that you have a right to be heard. If you have a right to be heard and you want that to be universal, then you also have to fight to make sure that other people have a right to be heard. Now, my master's thesis advisor was famous, or maybe infamous, for saying regularly in his graduate seminars, you have no constitutional right not to be offended. So we have free speech, but we also recognize that speech has consequences, and sometimes people are offended by the things that we say. You don't have a free speech right not to be offended, but you also don't necessarily have an unlimited free speech right to say whatever you want. You might legally have that, but it's not devoid of its consequences. So I brought in the master's thesis advisor. There's another professor of mine, Kevin Barge, who was also working with Jim Ani, and he often talked about the differences between free speech and responsible speech. If there's a lesson I can leave you with today, it's thinking about how these things might operate with one another. A few weeks ago when we talked about audience analysis, we talked about personal courtesy rather than political correctness. This idea that responsible speech is not necessarily about agreeing to all of the unwritten etiquette rules of what's appropriate or not appropriate to say, but it's about not being a jerk. It's about making sure that you're doing unto others as you would have them do to you. It's about making sure that you maintain your ethos, because it's very easy to lose, and once you lose your ethos, it's very hard to get it back. So as a parting thought today, what I'd like you to leave you with is the idea of free speech and responsible speech. I want you to be thinking critically over the next few weeks about what that looks like in your public speaking classroom or in other classes that you're taking, what it might look like in the workplace and what consequences might result from exercising free speech rights poorly in the workplace, what it might look like in conversation with various groups of people. You might have free speech things that you're comfortable saying in front of your friends and family that you're not comfortable saying in front of your grandma, not comfortable saying in front of a religious figure, not comfortable saying in front of somebody who would be hurt by the thing that you would say. It's not an easy tension to resolve, but I want you to be thinking about your own collective sense of ethics and what that would look like for you and how it plays out in your lives. So I'll leave you with that thought today, and we'll come back to talk about your second speech next week.